Hello and good morning. Morning to those of us in the US, and good afternoon to some of our panelists overseas in the UK and those in Europe and Asia. Good afternoon, good evening. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Emily McCrary Ruiz Esparza. I'm an independent journalist who covers work, the labor market, and women in the workplace. I contribute to outlets like the BBC, Quartz, Fast Company. I've written for Digiday's Work Life and a whole host of others. This webinar today is brought to you by Attuned. It's the AI-driven platform that measures intrinsic motivation and psychological safety. Attuned shows companies what really matters to their employees by making visible the psychological data that exists around and between people. This allows busy managers to get to know their teams quicker, identify blind spots at a glance, and communicate more effectively, driving engagement, productivity, and innovation, increasing psychological safety, and building happier organizations. Today, over the next hour, we'll be examining the state of motivation in 2024. To what extent is an individual influenced by external forces? Do the local, national, and global events have more than short-term effects on what we value and who we are? In the company's second annual State of Motivation report, which was released this month, Attune analyzed the responses of tens of thousands of Attune users around the world to open a window into global motivational trends, observing the influence of economic, political, socio-political, and environmental factors. To discuss some of the report's findings and so that we can glimpse their own observations and their areas of study, I'm joined by two academics who have studied motivation in the workplace, status, teaching young people, examining the way they do things before they enter the workforce. So to begin, I would like to have our panelists introduce themselves. We'll start with Amanda Jones at King's College London. Thanks for being here.
Hi, thanks for having me. So I'm Amanda, and I am from King's Business School at King's College London, and I'm an associate professor in organisational behaviour and human resource management, and I've looked at quite a few of these things. So I'm very looking forward to having this discussion.
And Sarah Doyle in Arizona.
Hi, I'm Sarah Doyle. I'm an associate professor of management and organizations at the University of Arizona, Eller College of Management. And thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here as well. A lot of my research looks at the motivations and desires that people have within hierarchical workplaces. So what drives people to pursue status, to compete, to cooperate with other people. So I'm really excited to have this conversation.
Great. So we'll be working from some of the data pulled from Attuned State of Motivation report. To give our audience context, they rate 11 motivators, things like security, financial needs, competition, altruism, status, the things that motivate our behavior. And year over year, they rank these things. So in this year's report, they used a 12-month look-back window, looking at the changes over the last year. Of course, in the report, they're also compared to the previous look-back window, which was about 5 years, and a new set of rankings emerged. The top-rated motivator in this past year was security. So they define this as the desire for planning and predictability, the need for precisely defined rules, clear frameworks and spheres of responsibility, and the need to strive for stability and permanence in all areas of life. Amanda, I want to start with you. We recently spoke for a story that I worked on for the BBC about the big layoffs that happened in late 2023 and early 2024. They continue, actually, at least here in the US. Even though labor markets in the US and the UK have been adding more jobs than expected in the last year, though I understand at the moment that might be reversing in the UK, I wonder if people are seeing the headlines and worrying about job security. Do you think this could explain security ranking so highly this past year?
Yes, well, I think, yeah, the short answer is yes to that. But I think also we have to consider lots of different aspects of the context and what we've seen kind of going on in the last few years. So while kind of jobs and different types of employment have been added in lots of places, and we're still seeing people in employment, what we're also seeing is this kind of greater use of more precarious work, certainly things like the gig economy, and that's both at the kind of high end and low end of the gig economy. But we're certainly seeing jobs that are not considered to be the traditional kind of, permanent job within a traditional organization where you might expect the kind of progress that we had in previous generations. But what I think is interesting is that while that's paying the bills, while you're doing that kind of role, that's fine. But as soon as things happen within the context that demonstrate just how precarious things like 0 hours contracts are, that causes people to reflect on the kind of employment insecurity that they have. So, for example, during the pandemic, when lots of organizations were worried that they wouldn't have the work anymore, those on 0 hours contracts are quite disposable. And maybe, that suddenly shows you that this kind of context is not going to help you in the long term. So it will have become much more salient to people that security perhaps wasn't something they were considering, and now it's become so much more important in this particular context. And I think that has come along with lots of different changes, including lots of redundancies that we've seen, and people worrying, about, well, what's going to happen in the new context. What can I do? What kind of job can I have that's going to add that element of permanency to make sure that I am okay going forward?
Yeah, I know. I've reported, myself being a freelancer, I've reported on freelance economy, gig work in the past. And while in one respect, it's harder for someone who's independent to lose all of their income at one time, like full-time workers can, there's still an incredible amount of instability that happens all the time. And as those big layoffs happen, for example, as a journalist, as those big layoffs happen, you might lose 2 of your editors, which can pull the rug out from under you, depending on sort of the state of your income at the moment. So, Amanda, what about the desire for precisely defined rules and clear realms of responsibility? Why do you think people might be desiring that right now?
I think this actually comes along with what we were just talking about, in that when you see a lot of layoffs, often what that can do is it can make the context of a role, or it can make the parameters of a role a lot more vague. Because if you're losing people out of the workforce, those jobs don't go away. You often still need those tasks to be done, but they may, under the guise of empowerment or efficiency, they may end up, falling onto other people. Now, in a context where people are experiencing much higher work intensification, there's good research on this. So people at Alan Felsted have looked at work intensification, and it never seems to go down. Every year we seem to see people working harder. I think people are much more aware now of the consequences that can have on their well-being and on their work-life balance. So actually, by focusing on, well, if we have more clear definitions of roles, that in some way allows us to kind of push back on this extra work. It probably also helps to reduce things like conflict, because poorly defined roles are quite susceptible to creating conflict in the workplace, which people don't like. And it stops you from, it gives you some kind of clarity over exactly what it is you have to do and what you can push back on. And I think that, as well as having something a bit more permanent, help you to feel much more secure in your environment.
Sarah, based on your research, how does a feeling of security first affect our willingness to compete with our colleagues? And secondly, our willingness to form social relationships with our colleagues?
Yeah, so really great question. So this core motivational need for order or security that was emerging in your data, when thinking about, how that might affect relationships, competition, there's really interesting research that shows that this motive for security often makes hierarchies psychologically appealing. And so the reason for that, according, to this research, is that this need for security is oftentimes a consequence of feeling like your personal control is threatened. And so people try to seek to restore that order in other ways. And so one way of doing that is kind of falling in line or in deference in these kind of hierarchical orderings. There's, not to get too off track, but there's this really fascinating study that was done by Stephen Saleh. It was published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. And he examined the number of people who converted to authoritarian churches before and after the Great Depression period. And so what he found was that during economic hardship, so when people felt like their personal control security was threatened, they were more inclined to convert to authoritarian churches. as compared to times when the economy was really good and they were feeling, already secure. And what that is suggestive of, and this has been also replicated kind of since then, Erin Kay and Justin Friesen have some really fascinating research more recently that has kind of built on that. But people want to restore this order. And so I bring this up because there's this really interesting paradox where, on the one hand, resource scarcity and this experience of job insecurity or economic hardship, it can make hierarchies appealing psychologically, but at the same time, we also know that hierarchies, and I know you had a webinar previously on this, but they can reinforce our tendency to view resources as limited or zero sum. And this is oftentimes what undergirds a lot of competitive behaviors and a hesitancy to forge or to develop cooperative social relationships. So it's kind of, potentially an interesting and indirect consequence of maybe people's immediate reactions to these types of situations. With all of that said, I don't think it's as simple just to say as, this kind of threatened personal sense of security is necessarily going to always create competitive dynamics. I think that, there's also research that people respond in these ways by wanting to come together and have stronger social bonds. And so I think probably it's a little bit more nuanced, and it is likely, my sense, if I were to speculate, it probably depends on kind of who you are building cooperative relationships with or who you're competing with. And I think there are probably some people that they go to. So, people that help to make them feel more secure, and then other people that they're more inclined to compete with or, to engage in some of those more harmful interpersonal dynamics.
Is it too simplistic of me to think that a need for security might have to do with, lingering reaction to the years of change that we experienced in workplaces and our jobs and the way we live in our homes and how much time we spend there, that were produced by the out of the ordinary circumstances of the pandemic? Maybe is that too simplistic?
I think it's certainly part of it. I'm curious to hear, Amanda's thoughts on this too, given, her expertise in kind of organizational change and things like that. But in general, I mean, people are averse to change. It's scary and it feels uncertain. And so it can lead people to behave in lots of, unusual and potentially destructive ways. It can really affect social relationships. And so we've experienced a ton of change with the pandemic. A lot of people's worlds have been completely, turned upside down. So I don't think it's too simplistic. I certainly think it's part of the story. I think there are, a lot of different contributing factors. But yeah, I think it's absolutely part of the story.
Yeah. Amanda, what would you add to that? I'd also like to hear your point of view.
I think the pandemic was fascinating because it was a real catalyst for behaviors that people maybe previously had wanted to exude in the workplace, but hadn't actually been able to. So one example of that is, I do a lot of work in remote working, and previously remote working was considered to be something that actually a lot of people didn't do. Even though it was popular, even though it was a good idea, people didn't do it because one of the things that they probably felt was if they did do it, they were less secure. So they could be, people in the workplace could do without them, or they might be overlooked for certain things. And what I find really interesting now is that actually, now that younger people have been able to work from home, and they really were a group that were excluded from this, rather than it being something that has made people feel more precarious, the changing norms that have happened have actually, they just consider that to be a normal part of work now. They would actually consider it strange if someone made them to go into the office a lot more. So I just think, we can't ever say that something is too simple in this kind of context, because the knock-on effects and the way that it's changed norms and that kind of thing, is quite far-reaching. It's this kind of complexity that we see throughout, a lot of the changes that we've seen. And I think what is important to recognize is that change is getting faster and faster. And, this is one of the things that makes people feel insecure as well, is that there has never been change as rapid as there is now, and that's not going to slow down. So it doesn't surprise me that on the opposite side of that, security will really reach the top of the thing that people focus on when they think about, how they want to feel in a workplace.
Let's talk about remote work and its effect on social relationships. Among all the 11 motivators, it was social relationships that saw the greatest increase in importance over the last year, though it ranked kind of middle of the road among all 11. It is increasing in popularity. Amanda, how has remote work, especially among young people, you mentioned it's just sort of an expectation. It would be strange if remote working weren't an option in some way. How has remote work changed the way people form relationships in the workplace, in particular, young folks?
I think it's interesting because it depends who you ask. So one of the things I find really interesting about our research that we've done on remote working is that everybody that we asked in our surveys and in some of our qualitative work was very, very concerned about young people, in particularly the impact that this will have on not just their social relationships at work, but on their productive relationships, on their ability to network, on that kind of thing. And everyone was very worried about this, except for young people. So they reported that they were basically fine with it. They actually felt that they were able to contribute more in meetings. They became the kind of technically mediated meetings meant that they felt more included. It was more kind of egalitarian. They could speak up a bit more. And so they had a much more positive effect. This had a much more positive effect. But I think we have to remember how their experiences were altered compared to other people during the pandemic, because these are, the younger generation, these are people who ended up doing things differently. They went through university in a more remote way. They've been kind of separated in a way that, we didn't really experience. So we're always making that comparison. How would we compare that to our university experience or to our, going into the workplace? And actually, they don't have that to compare to. So to them, it's not quite as stark as it might be to somebody who has been through that experience. But I think in some ways, it's changed relationships for the worse. I think one of the reasons people probably are focusing on this is because maybe they have experienced a bit of loneliness and isolation from this experience. But I think in the same way, it's really highlighted how important relationships are. So actually, if you're working remotely, you have to try much harder to make sure that you've got the kind of relationships that you need to get the job done, or you're, reaching out to the right kinds of people. So I think it's not surprising that it has a good kind of solid place in the middle of the motivators, because, people probably aren't as worried about it as they are like something about, security or finance, but they're probably still worried enough about it to make sure that it's kind of a solid influence on how they want to go forward.
Yeah.
If that's
Sarah, yes, it does. Sarah, what are the new standards that have been set for work relationships? Are they, Amanda mentioned that one has to work far more, has to work a lot harder just to make those relationships. If you've never met coworkers face to face, you're not passing them in the hallways. Is there a distance? Are people able to get closer when things are remote? What do you see?
Yeah, so I think what we're seeing in, data now, unfortunately, is that loneliness is at an all-time high, and a lot of organizations are trying to grapple with rise in mental health concerns with employees. And even though we don't have the same isolation that we did at the height of the pandemic, I think the effects of the pandemic and this loneliness has persisted in part because of the way it's changed how we work. And so sometimes, certainly there are absolutely benefits to the more virtual work or the more, hybrid workplace, the ability to work at home. But with that, I think also comes, some of these things that could be contributing to the loneliness. So the lack of social interactions, or I guess maybe not complete lack, but just decreased frequency of social interactions. And so in terms of, how this could have changed, or if there's a new standard for relationships in the workplace, it's interesting to me because, from a status perspective, there's a lot of instrumentality behind networking and focus on quantity of social relationships. And I think now we're seeing a shift towards, so away from quantity and more towards the quality. And people are craving that relational intimacy and those stronger social bonds. And so I think that there's greater value on vulnerability, authenticity, these types of more kind of human characteristics that are necessary to build those stronger, more intimate relationships at work. And it's really fascinating to kind of consider that, how those types of things are now valued and important in the workplace.
You've extensively studied status, hierarchy, competition in the workplace. When someone is sort of emotionally close to their colleagues, is it harder to compete against them?
So yeah, it actually, there's studies that in more that have looked at negotiating, and what they found is that, and so negotiations, sometimes people talk about those as competition. You're competing potentially over, scarce resources. And they found that individuals, so they've studied romantic partners and like best friends, people who are really, really close. And sometimes they actually come away with even worse outcomes for themselves, because they are almost too conceding. They're very averse to competing. And in some ways, it's important to be cooperative, but to also have this desire to push for, the best possible outcome for everybody. And so I think it definitely affects those dynamics. And it's interesting to think about how, it could be affecting competition and, the behaviors that result.
Well, I'd like to talk about status. So, in this report, the overall status score declined for the fourth year running in 2023, and it dropped a ranking into fifth place. Yet it still remains pretty high. It's still in the top half
Mhm.
importance rankings. Sarah, does it surprise you that status has been declining in importance for so long?
I wouldn't say it surprised me given what we've experienced in recent years, but it was extremely interesting to me because what we do know is that, as you mentioned, status is considered a fundamental human motive. Uh, my sense is that, so I would say a couple of things. First, as we've been talking about, there are just certain things that have increased in priority. So like relatively speaking, these are rankings. So it is looking kind of relative to other things. And so there are some things that have increased in importance. But the second thing that I actually wonder about is we've also seen an increase in social media and, a lot of other things that can help to fulfill this motive for status. So people are able to, be seen and recognized and feel like they have prestige and esteem on other platforms. And so it maybe makes it less, necessary to try and fulfill that in the workplace. And so if you can satisfy it, in other areas, it could affect what you're motivated by in organizations. Something else that I just want to add about this too, this wouldn't necessarily affect the decline, but it could just affect people's general reporting. We also know that people are hesitant to even report that they care about status. So I think that there could be, an underreporting. It's considered, a stigmatized quality. And some of my friends and collaborators, Nate Pettit and Hee-Young Kim, have some cool stuff on this. But, basically people are not only try to conceal that from others, but they also try to conceal it from themselves. It makes them, feel dirty when they feel like they care about status. And there's generational differences in this, there's cultural differences. So that could also, certainly, once again, wouldn't affect the decline in recent years, but just the baseline levels.
Gosh, I hadn't even considered the potential for social media fulfilling that need outside of the workplace. I'm not much of a social media user myself, but I certainly know, you know, when I post a piece that I've written on LinkedIn, like I want that affirmation. Like I want it. When I get an email after I've published something, I'm like, oh, I love that.
Yeah.
Landing a new placement. It's like, oh, it's just feels good. I'm not afraid to talk about that I'm status hungry. Totally fine with me, but I understand. I understand. I'm ambitious. I want to be at the top. No problem.
You're just
Amanda,
self-aware. That's an important
yeah,
quality too.
yeah, yeah. Amanda, you work. A lot of your students belong to Gen Z. What kind of career aspirations do you see? I'll point out that the BBC reported that this generation is increasingly rejecting prestige jobs. That was certainly part of my generation, millennials leaving the workforce. These are positions at brand name employers in really competitive industries that signal a pedigree, connections, and your skill. And instead, according to this report, they're opting for a new kind of prestige. So working with companies whose values match their own, they provide greater flexibility, they offer a better work-life balance. Of course, these are generalities. You're going to have exceptions at every generation across every gender and socioeconomic status. But Amanda, what kind of career aspirations do you see among the students that you teach?
Well, it's interesting actually, because I actually do some research on this. I've just started a project on this as well. Interested in things like employability and what students see or what they think organizations are interested in. And then hopefully when we get a bit further down the line in the project, what organizations think that students want from their organization. So we're looking for kind of a perception gap here. But what also is interesting is that when I'm looking at my sample, it will be in a kind of, top university business school, and that will have an important influence on the cohort and what they say. But in general, we can see certain things. So the kind of literature I tend to look at tends to be the careers literature and things that are very similar to what we're looking at in this report, actually, but kind of other aspects. So the Edgar Schein's, career anchors and that kind of thing. So what we do know is that on balance, career anchors have shifted, and career anchors are, you can describe them as basically kind of a fundamental self-concept. It's an aspect of your identity that leads you towards a particular type of career. And these are revealed to you throughout your lifetime. It might be that they change. For example, you might have children, and that might create more of a work-life balance anchor. But what we do know is in the past, people used to, according to the data anyway, people used to be much more inclined to want things like managerial competence, which would link to status and that kind of thing. Whereas now, if the data shows us that we're looking more, people are reporting that they want things like meaningful work. They're interested in doing jobs or being engaged in activities that do match their values, something that we often call the protein career. And we're looking at this goes alongside things like boundaryless careers where people are moving jobs more. So I think there's important things to think about in this regard. And I've certainly seen from my students that, and I do actually ask them, because I run a class on this, and I ask them individually, which of these anchors is most important to you? And they tend to say, meaningful work. Interestingly, they still say financial security, and they still say, all of the things that you found in your report at Attuned. But meaningfulness has certainly grown a lot, and they are much more interested in big problems. So Gen Z are interested in big problems rather than kind of the local group problem. So they're interested in things like climate change. They're interested in sustainability. They're interested in things that have become extremely important to them because it's going to affect them within their lifetime. And not only is it that that's important to them, there's a kind of social acceptability towards that as well. So, they wouldn't want to be seen working for something like the tobacco industry or something that isn't considered to be good for mankind. So I think that has a huge influence on what it is they want to do. But then on the other side of this, there is also this element of expectation. So I think a lot of them would never aim for a lot of managerial competence. I'd be interested to know what Sarah thinks about this, because obviously she's much more of an expert in this area. But the impression I get anyway is that a lot of them wouldn't aim or say they're going to aim for managerial competence or a high status position because they just don't expect to achieve it in the same way that they may have done previously when we had a more traditional career. And now that organizations are doing things like letting people go a lot more, jobs are more precarious, people are moving around, and we do have this boundaryless kind of career concept that people are engaged in. Is it worthwhile setting your sight on that if maybe, you can go, well, actually, it's more of a value system that I'm working towards here. It's more of a, I want a fulfilling career in terms of meaning, because that's what I can achieve, rather than some of the things that maybe in the past were more likely to achieve. So that's just another kind of devil's advocate opinion of why people might be looking towards some of those things.
I love that perception gap that you mentioned, because it just, especially when we're talking about what organizations can do practically, maybe through incentive structures, things like that, to motivate employees, it really has implications for misaligned incentive structures where, you're giving incentives that people don't necessarily value as much, or at least in the same way that they are thinking that they do.
We're hoping to see what those are, hopefully.
How fluid is the notion of a meaningful career? I just think of what I valued when I was 22 versus now. Do you think that's going to change, or is big picture just big picture, and climate change will continue to be a problem, and therefore an endless goal for people who see that as a career aim?
Well, yeah, if you don't mind if I respond to that, I find this really interesting, because it matches this idea, and it's something that we've seen for quite a while now. People like Jane Sturgis have written on this, but things like, what is success? What does success mean to somebody? So you can have different perspectives on what makes a successful career. Some of them will be measured objectively. What status did I get to? How much did I get paid? And some of them will be measured much more subjectively. What does a good career mean for me? And I think within the concept of meaningfulness, that really is quite a subjective thing. So it might be that, meaningful to me means that I have worked towards something, maybe a charitable endeavor, or maybe towards quality, or something that's really important to me. So I think really, rather than it being anything specific, it's a lot more related to have I done something, have I made progress in some area that aligns with my values, and that I consider to have personal importance. So I don't think it's necessarily one thing. I think we tend to find that those values converge among the younger generations, in that they tend to care more about sustainability, or they tend to care more about equality and diversity and inclusion, and there's certain things that are very important to them. But really, it is kind of a personal journey in that respect.
Yeah, I know that's something that employers and from the employer perspective are really struggling with, needing to hire people who belong to a generation, or even just mindset that I want to be contributing to something meaningful, and I want the company who employs me to reflect my values. And employers, in a lot of ways, being in a bind, going, I mean, we can only do our best. There are some things that a company cannot stand for by virtue of what they do. I'm going to use the example of a tobacco company. They can't stand for the health and well-being of their customers, and therefore even their employees. And so they're a unique sort of fringe example, but there are a lot of companies who, by virtue of what they do, they're not going to be able to reflect that. And they may have tried at first with some clever PR or campaigns or branding, but more and more they're coming to terms with the fact that they're just going to have to focus on other things. There's a professor at NYU, Allison Taylor, who wrote a great book that came out last month called Higher Ground. And it's all about the struggle of C-suites and boards to deliver on that. How do you behave ethically when a lot of what's ingrained in your business just isn't, and it's not going to match the notion of contributing to the greater good that a lot of employees want to see now, regardless of age. It's not just young people. A lot of people want to do that now. Amanda, you mentioned, oh, please go ahead.
So I was just going to build on that. So actually, in one of my recent papers with Tracy Dumas and Bob Lount, we found value dissimilarity. When employees feel high levels of value dissimilarity, it reduces their engagement in their work, which makes sense, which is one of the challenges, that companies are facing. But what we found is that one of the reasons why is because they feel this internalized sense that they're not respected by their workplace. And so when you identify this mechanism and this diminished sense of respect that they're feeling, we identified, something that could potentially help that, so alleviate that diminished respect, and then therefore it buffered engagement. And that specific thing was providing platforms where employees could engage in small talk or small kind of self-disclosures where they built social bonds. So it comes back to this importance of building strong, intimate social relationships. And what this did, it's almost, it kind of compensates for the value dissimilarity, but it helps to alleviate, once again, that diminished felt respect because you have these strong social bonds. And then that there in turn help to avoid the engagement decline that we were otherwise seeing.
Gosh, how interesting. Yeah, these little cohorts of mutual support.
Yeah.
Amanda, you mentioned that still among young people, when you ask them, what their anchors are, financial security still comes up. And among the 11 motivators, financial needs saw the greatest decrease. And financial needs in this context mean the desire for financial security and well-being, a liking for activities entailing the generation of profit, and endeavors to accumulate and safeguard wealth. And it ranked, even though it declined, it was still ranked at number 2, so very high. I mean, do you think inflation is enough to explain this high ranking? Why do you think this one might be sinking in importance, but also still remaining quite high?
I think the first thing I thought when I saw this, and I looked at it obviously in relation to the other different motivators, was that actually I consider this to be inherently kind of linked to security. So I think what you're probably seeing here, yes, inflation is definitely important. People have their eye on that, and they're concerned about it. I think for young people in particular, I know you mentioned young people, this is something that has a different level of significance to them as maybe it has previous generations. So if you look at a lot of the data on how much wealth, or how much of the wealth of an economy is owned by young people, especially in countries like the UK, it's a lot less than it was for generations of, in the past. They don't have as much money. It's going to be much more expensive for them to buy a house, for them to be able to afford to do lots of things. So I think, it's something that's always going to be on their mind. But I think for the whole population, everyone's aware that there's a cost of living crisis. Inflation is high. So this is something that's going to continue to be important. But I think what's interesting is about, why maybe it's dropped compared to security. And I think perhaps it is because these two are, highly related to each other, but perhaps people are prepared to trade off a little bit of financial gain for a bit more security, given how precarious things are. And that would be my take on it anyway. That would be what I see happening here. This is still high. This is also high, but they've switched places because they would make sure that, security was at the top and finance is part of that.
That's certainly reflected in some of the McKinsey, Deloitte type surveys that I see, where folks are willing to forego a pay raise in exchange for skills training, which is going to make them more secure in their job, maybe even stay at the company longer. They would rather forgo and pay in the immediate than just say, all right, I want to make sure that my job's not going away with whatever next tech thing comes out. Even just exchanging that for some benefits that do kind of amount to financial needs. So for instance, reproductive care is very expensive. And in the US, employers are offering huge packages around IVF and different fertility treatments that for a single cycle can cost $20,000 to $30,000. That's absolutely a financial need being met, but they would rather have that than a larger paycheck. They're just willing to exchange that. Most motivators tend to change in ranking year over year, but altruism is one that tends to remain pretty high. This year it's number 4. For purposes of this discussion, we'll consider altruism the endeavor to help, support, and maintain the well-being of others, as well as the expectation that others will help us if we need it, and a preference for an environment where this comes about on a mutual basis. Sarah, you've studied the relationship between status change and our willingness to help others. Tell us what you've learned and whether the persistence of altruism surprises you. Is that what you would expect to see?
Yeah, so in our research, we were focusing on the more informal status hierarchies that emerge within work groups, within a department. And these types of status hierarchies can fluctuate and change a lot over time. So as people do those skills trainings, right, and they develop skills, they increase their value or their worth, their status is going to increase. People are going to give them more influence, more, say over the decisions that are being made. And then relatively speaking, when someone increases in status, this necessarily means that if we're thinking of, strictly zero-sum world here, but others are going to become relatively less potentially influential, and so incurring a status loss. And so these changes can happen over time. And so we wanted to consider, Bob Lout and I in this research, we wanted to consider how these fluctuations or these changes impact people's concern for others at work, and then subsequently their willingness to help them. And perhaps unsurprisingly, we found that when people lose status, they become more disconnected from others. So they're less concerned with the well-being of others, with the interests of the group or department. And so they're less inclined to help. But what's really fascinating is that when people incurred a status gain, so when they rose in status, they actually weren't more likely to help. So you didn't get the commensurate increase in helping to make up for, the decline in helping that we saw from the people who lost status. And our theory or arguments underlying this really come back to this fundamental bias that we have, which is called the self-serving attributional bias. And so basically this idea that when people lose status, they deflect blame. And so they blame other people, they become less, concerned, less willing to help other people. And when people gain or incur a positive outcome, they accept personal responsibility for that. So I'm here because I've worked really hard. And so they're kind of blinded to how the social environment or how other people contributed to that positive outcome. And so that, means that potentially, they're not necessarily giving back to the people who gave to them and contributed to their status gain. So that's what we found in that research. Your other question was, so does it surprise me if the altruism, the need for a desire for altruism, the consistency of that? No, it doesn't. And I think, similar to how the financial ranking is inextricably linked to the need for security, I think altruism is also kind of linked to social relationships. And so, people want to have this bond and this connection with people at work. And, simultaneously, they have these very personal and instrumental motives. And so these things can coexist. It's not necessarily, one or the other. And I think that's probably what we're seeing here.
I did a white paper with Attuned last summer, and it was about conflict and specifically in a hierarchical workplace. And I remember reading one paper about the capacity for empathy and how that changes, actually specifically how it decreases at highest ranks of an organization. So they would survey folks at, across many companies at various rankings, specifically senior leadership all the way up to CEOs in the C-suite and even the board. And the higher you go in the organization, the empathy scores just kept dropping. It was just an inverse effect, this ability. And what was funny is it wasn't they would do it over time as well. So that same person they would have surveyed when they were let's say in a middle manager role, by the time they were sitting in an EVP, their empathy scores had decreased. And the more powerful.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And you may have discussed this study too, but related to that, there's this research that was done, and they asked, participants in this study were both high-level executives, so individuals with high power and high-ranking positions, and then lower-level employees. And they asked both groups of people to draw a capital letter E on your forehead. And so all these people do the capital letter E, And it turns out the high-level executives drew the E on their forehead so that it would be, in the order of their perspective. So it was an E from their perspective. And individuals, the lower ranking employees, they drew an E on their forehead so that it read like an E for someone, another person's perspective. And so basically this idea that, power, the experience of power, these people in high ranking positions, it can reduce empathy in part because it blinds us to the perspective of others. We don't think about others' perspective as much.
Yeah, and some people who are in very high-ranking positions just don't have much exposure to
Yeah.
one has to make a point to go and work with other people. And look, there are networking programs and executive sponsorship programs that do that. But the exposure to someone who's at lower tiers is still low. And the person you're mentoring or sponsoring is probably on their way to your position anyway, and shares a lot with your personality, being very ambitious and, shall we say, status driven.
It's really interesting because this corresponds with some of the personality research and how, looking for things like leadership quality, and how if you use things like the Big Five model, previous research has shown that for team workers, for example, agreeableness is a trait that is attractive, but for leadership, that goes right down, and it's other things like, extroversion, which are not, the same kind of things. That sounds like really interesting research.
I just did a piece on the size of the C-suite and how there's so many more C-suite roles than there were 10 years ago. Used to be there was kind of a core triangle, CEO, CFO, and maybe a CTO or an operating officer. And now there can be upwards of 10 or 12 executives in a C-suite, and how the decision-making process now for so many businesses is that much harder, where those people, they got there because agreeableness was not necessarily on their CV, right? And now you have all these people who qualify as executives sitting in a room together, and much less is getting done because that skill was not one that they needed to develop on their way up. Okay, so respondents ranked one motivator, rationality, the lowest this year. It was at the bottom of the barrel. For the purposes of this discussion, rationality will be an attraction to logical, objective, and scientific methods, the endeavor to make decisions based on factual data and connections of cause and effect, and by taking into account objective feedback from others. One of the women I spoke to when working on this report, Emily Williams, noted that recent calls to redesign the workplace, both physically and culturally, meet the needs of workers rather than the needs of employers, could be an explanation for the increase of rationality reports. It did tick up, though it remained low. Amanda, employers are tracking metrics. A lot of these are buzzwords, but I mean, sometimes employers are required by law to track some of these, specifically related to ESG, CSR, DEI. Many believe that tech, like artificial intelligence, helps them make better, more objective decisions. Amanda, do you think it's possible to create a rational workplace? And is that something we even need?
This is really interesting to me, especially because I recently have acquired a PhD student who is looking at something very similar to this. So what we kind of know from the literature on things like, recruitment is that there's lots of good evidence to show that some of these methods of doing things, have better outcomes than the more traditional kind of using your gut feeling or that kind of thing. But what we also know is that it seems that a lot of managers are not adopting some of these things, even though they know that there's good evidence for them. So this is one of the things that my student is looking at. It's a very interesting area. But what I think is really interesting as well is when you look at this in context. So one of the things I know, and I might be jumping the gun here, but one of the motivators that came up was this idea of autonomy. And autonomy continues to be something that's very important to people. And I think sometimes there's this perspective that using some of these things might in some way detract from autonomy. That's one thing. And so that's one perspective. But then there's another aspect that occurs to me, is that you've got mixed messages. When you're an organization, when you're a manager, there are lots of things that you are expected to do that are best practice, or that, help you to create the right environment for, being an employer of choice, or, this kind of stuff. And one of those is also cultural fit. So people look to, having this notion of cultural fit within organizations. Now, that's not to say that you can't have a culture that appreciates things like ED&I and appreciates, equity. In fact, lots of organizations do, like, people are equity sensitive and they want to see, good kind of justice in organizations. But sometimes when people pursue this notion of cultural fit, that they tend to associate with, their gut. And if there's certain organizations that they get people in, I'm not going to name them, but they get people into the interview and they'll be like, oh, no, that person's got the stuff of this organization. And that's not a very scientific method of, deciding who you're going to have working with you. But it's a very attractive method to somebody who believes they've created the right culture because they think they've done everything right anyway. So, this kind of person, maybe they're a referral from somebody who you already think is a great person and a great citizen within your culture. And so there's this kind of weird, almost situation that people are faced with where, do we go down the scientific method, but that can seem a bit sterile when we're actually looking to have these kind of human, more intuitive ways of doing things. So I think, yes, these things have value. Yes, we've definitely seen that they could be something that people like, especially if they help our perceptions of equity and, fairness and inclusion. But also, it's going to be hard to convince people that that's something that you can just do to create the kind of unique culture that you need to compete, not just in the marketplace, but also becoming an employer of choice.
I recently spoke to a guy who'd spent 20, 25 years recruiting for major companies, mostly in retail, clothing retail, the parent company of Net-a-Porter, and he'd worked at Levi's and all this stuff. And a lot of these companies, from the top, from the chief talent acquisition or CHRO said, we're going to create rubrics for evaluation for interviewees. We're going to, form an agreement across the hiring committee about what we want to see in this new candidate. And then when it comes to the actual decision being made about who they hire, he said, if you ask that hiring manager about why they chose that person, they can't give you a reason related to that rubric. It has to do with, if they were really being honest, it's, I liked that person the best. That doesn't mean they're going to be the wrong fit for the job, but it's this unidentifiable quality that it's that gut. That's what a lot of people end up making that final decision, or I related to them more, or they reminded me of myself. I see reflection of my own career in them, my own personality. And that even though we introduce these, qualitative methods, lots of decisions come down to something that's a little bit indefensible. Even if it is the right decision, there's not an argument someone can make for why they made the decision they did. The conversation we had was specifically about legal liability. And when when hiring decisions are made, like, can a company actually defend the decision that they have? And he was like, no, there's no magic to this. Okay, so you brought up,
Just related to that, this is
yeah,
kind of scary, but there was this research that was done, and they had people kind of role playing, interviewer and interviewee, and people evaluated others more favorably when they mimicked the gestures and body language of the person interviewing them. So like the interviewer crosses your leg, and then the person, being interviewed in this role play exercise crosses their leg, and they were evaluated more favorably, which is kind of scary, but it goes in line with, you evaluate those that remind you of yourself, that you like more, that you're more, yeah. So it's quite interesting.
actually might use that now. So
Yeah.
maybe if it works. Yeah.
I know. Yeah.
Books out there to tell you exactly how to do that.
All right. So you brought up autonomy, Amanda, and I do want to go there. As a motivator, autonomy declined in importance year over year since 2018. And that trend continued this last year. And the motivator landed its all-time low at 10th place out of 11. The academics I spoke to when I was working on this report speculated that this might be the result of this need being largely met. So, for instance, many workers now have control over their working hours and their working environment. They're working remotely. more control than they did in the past. Sarah, how does a feeling of autonomy affect our willingness to get along with the people we work with? And does it tend to separate us, or does it unite us with pro-social behaviors?
Yeah, so this is always a little bit of a cop-out answer, but I think it's probably both. It has the ability to do both. And so I think it's probably less about whether autonomy decreases or increases our willingness to build social relationships, or whether it separates or pulls us together. But I think it kind of comes back to that, something I mentioned earlier is who you're doing that with. So I think when you have greater autonomy, you have more control over who you are forging those relationships with, who you're interacting with more. And something that could be happening, especially now, we know when people feel, once again, kind of in experiences like this, maybe threatened or insecure, they tend to gravitate towards people of their in-group. And so it could be, kind of bringing people together they feel similar to, who bring comfort to them. And the flip side of that is kind of unfortunate, because it could possibly mean that it's pulling apart people who are different. And so, the in-group, out-group kind of attitudes there. So it could be pulling people into those that they feel aligned with, and then separating those who maybe are different. And so, we already have an intense divide in, our society and today. And so, to the extent that autonomy is having, this effect too, it could be pretty interesting to consider and look into, because if there's anything that could be done to aid that, separation, would be helpful.
A lot of your work, Amanda, has to do with remote work. You've become an expert on this, as well as work-life balance. Are you surprised by autonomy's low ranking?
Not really. I mean, I think I consider it in the same way that the other academic colleagues that you spoke to consider it. It's not that it's not important. It's just that because of the amount of it that we've, especially that we've seen since the pandemic. I mean, we've done some research on outcomes like well-being and that kind of thing. And we know that autonomy is important, and we know that things like perceived organizational support is important. And actually, it might be that giving people autonomy, especially over the place of work and the timing of work, is actually integral to perceived organizational support. It's something that you expect. So, I think it's becoming more normal. And I think, especially in professional jobs, it's becoming more normal. It might not be if you look at different parts of the economy, but I think it's become something that has improved for a lot of people. Therefore, rather than it not being important, it's just less of a priority. Because it might be we've got plenty of autonomy. Actually, if you work in the gig economy, you might have too much autonomy. You might actually prefer to have slightly more security than autonomy. So I don't think it's that surprising, but I think it remains fundamental to people's enjoyment of work, to their satisfaction, and to their engagement as well.
I suppose to some extent it's just like you talked about your students, they just expect remote work to be a part of the deal. Even maybe it's hybrid, but that it would just be a part of the work arrangement that they end up with.
Absolutely. I mean, we found in our research that we did with the senior managers in London, that I did at King's and with the Policy Institute, that actually there seems to have been a power shift in the way that people perceive these kinds of work. So rather than it being the employee that has to prove or kind of demonstrate a case for why they can work remotely, it almost now seems like it's up to the employer to explain why they need to come into a location, or they need to come into the office. And if they can't do that, then they're not really perceived to be a very supportive employer. So yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah, and so many employers who call folks back. I mean, some folks just decided to quit rather than return to the office. Some had moved away from the work site. I mean, to different cities or states. And I know, for example, Google in Texas ordered some folks back, and they were like, "Well, I live in Oklahoma now. I don't know what you want me to do. I don't know how you expect me to return now."
That's true. I'm doing some work at King's with two colleagues, Mike Clinton and Tara Rigg, and when we've looked at organisations where policies have been put in place to bring people back, a lot of the times, quite simply, they just don't come back. They're just, the policy's there, but they don't enforce the policy, and people don't come back. So we don't have really the ability to look at how that went when you brought people back into the office, because they're just not following the policy. So that's good evidence that there has been some kind of power shift. And I think, that is something that people are going to have to, whether it might take them a while to recognize that norms have changed in that way, but they're going to have to accept this at some point and work with it.
We're at the top of the hour. Amanda and Sarah, thank you so much for being here. I've really enjoyed this. It's a great way to spend an hour that passed very quickly, thanks to your wonderful knowledge. You've been so generous with your time and with your research. Thank you so much. And thank you to Attuned for hosting this discussion. A recording of today's session will be available in a few days. Those of you who registered will be getting one by email. It will also be available on attune.ai. So thank you to everyone. Take care and be well.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much.